You, on your feet. The words cut through the room without warning. Not loud but sharp enough to end whatever private calm existed just seconds earlier. Screens freeze. Pens stop. A few students look up, confused, still halfway inside their own thoughts. The professor doesn't repeat himself. He doesn't explain. He doesn't even look in her direction at first. He doesn't need to. The command already owns the space. A pause stretches, heavy and public, and then the chair scrapes softly as she stands. Not rushed, not defiant, just precise. She knows exactly how long it takes to rise without drawing attention, because avoiding attention has been practice, not instinct. She didn't fail. She wasn't disruptive. She hadn't raised her hand or spoken out of turn. Her only deviation was silence. She watched instead of performing. She listened instead of displaying. That was enough. A few heads turn. A breath of laughter escapes somewhere in the middle rows, quick and unchecked. Someone leans back in their chair, already detached, already convinced this moment doesn't concern them. 3 rows back, a student glances at her, then away, as if distance might protect him. The crowd reacts before she does. That's how these moments always work. By the time the target understands what's happening, the room has already agreed on the outcome. Silence chooses a side without ever announcing itself. The professor finally turns. He wears the same smile he always does when he thinks he's about to teach a lesson that isn't on the syllabus. It's light, casual, almost bored. The smile of someone who believes the ending has already been written. He taps the chalk against the board once, not to get attention, but because he enjoys the sound it makes when a room goes quiet. "Let's see what you actually know," he says, his voice smooth, controlled, loud enough for every corner to hear. No accusation yet, just invitation shaped like a trap. He turns and writes. The chalk moves quickly, confidently, like this is routine. Symbols stack on symbols. Lines stretch across the board, dense and unforgiving. This is not material from last week. Not even from this course. It's elevated, compressed, deliberately misplaced. He steps back just enough for the equation to be fully visible, fully public. He doesn't ask if anyone recognizes it. He doesn't frame it as a challenge. He frames it as obvious. Basic stuff, he adds, waving the chalk lightly, as if brushing away something small. Don't overthink it. Mockery arrives before difficulty does. Contempt before instruction. The message is clear without ever being spoken directly. If you belong here, this shouldn't slow you down. And if it does, that tells us something important about you. A few students exchange looks. Someone mouths, "Wow." Another student tilts their phone just slightly, camera angled low, careful not to be obvious. The moment is being archived before it's even finished. She walks to the board when he gestures. Slowly. Not because she's unsure, but because speed would invite interpretation. She doesn't ask why her name was called. She doesn't protest the fairness of the task. She doesn't explain that this isn't part of the course. Explanation would sound like defense, and defense would sound like guilt. Instead, she moves with the same restraint she uses every day, the kind learned over time, the kind that keeps people guessing. Her stillness reads as uncertainty to them. That's useful. Let them underestimate the silence. Let them confuse patience for weakness. The professor steps aside, fully now, creating space between himself and the board, between himself and responsibility. He checks his phone casually, deliberately, a performance of certainty. The outcome, in his mind, is already decided. He doesn't need to watch her fail. Failure is assumed. His attention drifts because his power feels secure. Someone in the front row whispers, "This is cruel," barely audible, just enough to exist without consequence. Someone else raises their phone higher. The chalk is placed in her hand. It's lighter than she expects. Or maybe she notices because she's counting. Counting breaths. Counting symbols. Counting the seconds it takes for a room to turn hostile without anyone raising their voice. She faces the board, not the room. That part is intentional. The task is visible. The audience is watching. She is aware of both, but she doesn't acknowledge either. Instead, Her eyes move slowly across the equation, left to right, top to bottom. She recognizes the structure immediately, but recognition doesn't rush her. She maps the problem quietly, mentally separating what belongs from what's meant to distract. She notices an assumption hidden in the second line. She notices where most people would panic, where shortcuts would tempt the careless. She says nothing. Behind her, the room holds its breath, though most of them don't realize it yet. They're waiting for a stumble, a pause, a confession of confusion. The professor looks up from his phone just long enough to confirm that she hasn't spoken, then looks away again, satisfied. He believes silence means surrender. He believes stillness means she's already lost. She adjusts her grip on the chalk. Not nervous, practical. She's seen this equation before, though no one here knows that. She doesn't smile. She doesn't react. She simply stands there, counting, recognizing, preparing. Every silent second stretches the moment, deepens the exposure. The longer she waits, the more certain the room becomes. And certainty, once it hardens, is difficult to undo. The chapter doesn't end with movement. It doesn't end with resistance or revelation. It ends with suspension. A young black woman standing alone at the board, an impossible demand glowing behind her, a professor already convinced of her failure, and a room full of witnesses who believe they are about to watch someone disappear. She doesn't turn around. Not once. Turning would invite the room back into her body, and she refuses to give them that access. Instead, she lets the silence work. It stretches long enough for discomfort to set in, long enough for people to shift in their seats, long enough for the certainty in the room to grow heavy and careless. This is the part they always misunderstand. Silence isn't absence. It's space, and space lets her see everything. She traces the equation again with her eyes, slower this time, not because she needs to, but because she's checking assumptions. She remembers the way her father used to pause before writing anything important. He would say nothing, just stare, as if listening for something beneath the numbers. She doesn't think of him directly now. She doesn't need to. The habit remains. Count the terms. Isolate the constraint. Ignore what's meant to intimidate. The professor built this to look impossible in public. That means the trick isn't in complexity. It's in pressure. Behind her, the room murmurs. Not loud enough to be called out. Loud enough to feel. Someone whispers her name, mispronounces it, then stops. Another student clears his throat, like he wants the moment to end quickly, cleanly, without anyone having to sit with it too long. The professor glances up from his phone again, checks the clock on the wall, then sighs, exaggerated. Time, he says casually, as if announcing a fact rather than creating one. This shouldn't take you all day. A few people laugh. It's nervous now, the kind of laughter that wants permission. He hasn't told her to stop. He hasn't told her to continue. He's just framing the moment as already wasted, framing her presence as an inconvenience. He steps closer, not to help, but to reclaim the center of the room. You see, he adds, loud enough for everyone to hear. This is what happens when people confuse confidence with competence. She hears every word. She doesn't respond. She notices instead how he positions himself slightly to the side, so the class sees him and her at once. Authority and subject. Judge and exhibit. This is public power carefully staged. He isn't correcting the equation. He isn't even looking at it. He's narrating her supposed failure in advance. That matters. She files it away. Her chalk touches the board for the first time. The sound is small, but it slices through the room. A few heads jerk up. Someone gasps softly, surprised not by what she's written, but by the fact that she's written anything at all. She writes one line, then stops. Not to think. To let it sit there. To let the room register that this isn't random. That it isn't panic. The professor squints, confused for half a second, then recovers. Careful, he says lightly. That assumption won't hold. He doesn't explain which one. He doesn't need to. The dismissal is the point. She doesn't correct him. She lets the wrongness hang in the air, unchallenged. Let the audience feel it later. She adds another line beneath the first. Neat. Precise. Someone in the front row leans forward. Another student lowers their phone, unsure now whether they're recording embarrassment or something else. The professor folds his arms, a smile returning to his face, thinner this time. Memorization is impressive, he says. Understanding is rarer. There it is. Not about math anymore. About identity. About who is allowed to know things without suspicion. The accusation lands without evidence, and because it's spoken publicly, it sounds like truth. She hears it and keeps writing. Her hand is steady. Her breathing stays even. She remembers the margin notes she's seen in old notebooks, the warnings about ego disguised as intellect. She remembers how certain people panic when their authority isn't mirrored back to them immediately. The room feels different now. Not kinder, just unsure. Silence doesn't mean support. It means recalculation. She writes one more line, then pauses again, chalk resting against the board. The professor steps closer, close enough that the class can hear him without amplification. You don't belong here if you think guessing is scholarship, he says, voice smooth, controlled. An identity-based accusation, delivered cleanly. No raised voice, no anger, just certainty. She doesn't turn. She doesn't answer. She lets the words exist where everyone can hear them. Let them be remembered. Let them be repeated later if necessary. She adds another symbol. Someone in the back whispers, "Wait." Another student shakes their head slowly, not in disbelief anymore, but in something closer to confusion. The professor laughs once, sharp. "This is painful," he says. "For everyone." Her chalk stops midline. Not because she's stuck, because she's finished mapping the rest. She knows exactly how this will end if she rushes. She knows exactly how it will end if she waits. The professor thinks the danger has passed, that the spectacle is already complete. He turns slightly, addressing the room instead of her now. "Let this be a lesson," he begins, settling into his role. He doesn't notice that she's still holding the chalk. He doesn't notice the way the class has gone completely silent, the kind of silence that doesn't belong to him. She stands there, unmoving, eyes on the board, chalk poised. The equation no longer a threat, but a doorway. The audience watches. The professor speaks. And somewhere in that gap, where certainty overreaches itself, the balance begins to shift. The segment ends not with revelation, but with tension tightening. With a room no longer sure what it's about to witness. With authority still speaking, still confident, unaware that the ground beneath its words is about to give way. She writes, not fast, not slow, each mark placed with intention, as if speed itself would be a kind of mistake. The chalk moves in short, clean strokes, stopping where it needs to stop, continuing only when the structure demands it. Before the equation is halfway complete, the room changes. Subtle at first. A whisper rises from the second row, then dies when someone else notices the direction the symbols are taking. A chair scrapes softly as a student leans forward without realizing it. Another student straightens, phone still raised, unsure now whether they're recording failure or something that shouldn't be missed. She keeps writing. The professor looks up fully for the first time. Not a glance this time, a stare. His certainty doesn't vanish, but it tightens like a belt pulled one notch too far. She adds the final line, closes the structure, and steps back just enough to see the whole thing at once. The solution is complete. No flourish, no emphasis, just finished. Silence crashes into the room. Not the awkward silence of confusion, the heavy kind, the kind that presses on ears and skin. Louder than applause would have been. Someone opens their mouth, then closes it. Another student shakes their head once, slow, like they're recalculating something they thought they understood. The professor turns toward the board. His smile falters for half a second. It's brief, almost imperceptible, but it exists. Then it hardens into something flatter, controlled. Interesting, he says, voice light, dismissive. He lets the word hang there, pretending to consider it. Then he adds, too interesting. The room holds its breath. Not because he's loud, because he isn't. He doesn't acknowledge the work. Not a single line. Not a single symbol. He pivots instead, steps closer to her, close enough that the class can see them both in the same frame. "Where did you get this?" he asks, tone casual, but the question sharp. He doesn't wait for an answer. "Who helped you?" Another step. "Do you expect us to believe this just happened?" Suspicion floods the space where shock used to live. Heads turn again, but differently now. Success has been reclassified as danger. He laughs once. Dry. Not amused. "People like you," he says carefully, "don't just arrive here knowing things like this." It lands exactly how he intends. Identity, not skill. The room absorbs it without protest. Someone nods. Someone else looks down. No one challenges the framing. Authority has spoken publicly. That makes it feel official. He straightens, already moving past her as if she's been resolved. "We'll be looking into this," he announces to the room, not to her. "Cheating. Misconduct. An inquiry." He lists the words casually, like items on an agenda, as if the conclusion is administrative, not personal. As if this is routine. The system responds quickly. That's what systems do when protecting their own. Emails arrive before the day ends. Formal language. Neutral tone. Meetings scheduled during break, when fewer eyes are around to notice. Quiet efficiency. No witnesses required. The class disperses in fragments. Conversations half-formed. Glances unfinished. No one says goodbye to her. No one needs to. She doesn't correct him. Not when he misnames her work. Not when he misframes her intent. Not when he implies dishonesty without proof. She lets him be wrong. Again. And again. Each escalation worse than the last. He reframes her success as moral failure now. Luck. Memorization. A fluke disguised as brilliance. He repeats it publicly, confidently, until it begins to sound like fact. She listens. Counts. Stores every word. Every claim. Every declaration made without evidence. Silence remains her choice, not her cage. At home, much later, she opens a box she was never meant to need. It lives at the back of a closet, beneath things she doesn't touch often. The lid sticks slightly, like it's been resisting this moment. Inside are old notebooks, paper yellowed at the edges, handwriting careful and dense, the kind that takes patience to read. Proofs written slowly, patiently, across years. Her father's work. She flips pages without urgency. She knows these pages, knows the rhythm of his thinking, the way he'd annotate his own doubts in the margins, then resolve them 3 pages later. Her hands stop. The equation stares back at her. The same one. Not similar. Not inspired by. The same structure. The same approach. Her eyes trace the date in the corner. Decades earlier. Her breath stays even. She turns another page. More notes. Refinements. Extensions. And then she sees it. A name in the margin. Not hers. Not his. The professor's. Her silence shifts meaning in that moment. What once kept her safe now sharpens into focus. This wasn't humiliation. It wasn't random cruelty. It was recognition. And the man who accused her already knows exactly why. She doesn't sleep much that night. Not because she's panicking, but because her mind is too orderly now. Pieces have aligned, and alignment brings clarity, not rest. She sits at her desk with the notebooks spread open, careful not to disturb their order. She doesn't rush through them. She doesn't skim. She reads the way she was taught to read them, tracing logic, following turns, noting where her father hesitated and where he was certain. Every page confirms the same thing. The equation wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't borrowed inspiration. It was lifted, refined, repackaged, and presented to the world by someone who learned early how to turn access into ownership. She doesn't feel anger yet. Anger would be noise. This requires quiet. The next morning, the consequences begin to arrive in daylight. Students whisper when she enters the building. Not openly. Just enough to mark distance. Someone who sat near her the week before chooses a different seat now. Another offers a tight smile, the kind that wants to appear kind without taking a risk. The professor passes her in the hallway and doesn't slow down. Doesn't acknowledge her at all. That too is public. Power doesn't always need words. Sometimes absence is the message. The inquiry moves fast. That speed is framed as fairness. Neutral emails arrive with subject lines that sound procedural. Academic integrity review. Required attendance. Failure to comply. Every message assumes guilt without ever stating it outright. She notices how often the professor's words appear in quotation marks, how rarely hers do. Authority echoed is authority multiplied. When she's asked to explain herself, she doesn't. Not because she can't, because explanation would concede the frame. She submits documentation instead. Course records. Independent evaluations from previous terms. Copies of handwritten notes dated long before she ever entered this building. Evidence exists before revelation. She knows that matters. The response is delayed. Not dismissed, just postponed. Silence from the system feels different than silence from a person. It stretches, tests patience. She lets it. The professor continues teaching as if nothing has changed. In class, he references the incident without naming her. Brilliance without discipline, he says once, pacing slowly. That's how fraud happens. Heads nod. The room accepts the lesson because it's been framed as moral guidance, not accusation. He escalates each time her name isn't spoken. Calm responses from the administration trigger harsher commentary from him. Equilibrium irritates ego. He needs escalation to reassert control. She attends every class. Same seat. Same posture. Same restraint. She takes notes. She watches how often he repeats the same phrases, how his examples circle back to legitimacy and belonging. She notices which students laugh too quickly and which ones stop laughing altogether. Silence keeps paying dividends. The meeting finally happens. A small room, glass walls, enough visibility to claim transparency, not enough audience to feel dangerous. The professor speaks confidently, declarative, dismissive. He doesn't hedge. He never does. He presents his version of events as settled truth. A student exceeded expectations. Suspiciously. Patterns didn't align. Background raised questions. He frames vigilance as responsibility. The institution listens carefully. When she's invited to speak, she doesn't argue. She corrects one thing. Only one. At maximal stakes. She states a date. Then another. She slides copies of notebook pages across the table. Not originals. Copies. Originals remain with her. Protection matters. She doesn't say where they came from. She doesn't explain motive. She assumes truth is sufficient. The temperature in the room shifts. Not dramatically. Just enough. Someone clears their throat. Another person asks for verification. External review is suggested. Authority resists briefly, then agrees, confident it will confirm what they already believe. Certainty behaves like that. It welcomes scrutiny it thinks it controls. Days pass, then weeks. Experts review the work without names attached. The math speaks for itself. Validation arrives sideways, reluctantly. No praise, just confirmation. The institution doesn't celebrate. It recalibrates. A faculty member requests a private conversation. Not private enough to violate visibility. Just quiet. She remembers her father. Remembers the year he vanished from the program. Remembers the paper that followed. Her voice doesn't shake when she says it. She has carried the weight long enough that it has settled into something solid. Her testimony adds friction to a system built to slide past discomfort. The professor is asked to clarify inconsistencies. He doesn't reflect. He doubles down. His words from the classroom are replayed. His certainty is examined under its own light. Contradiction emerges, clean and undeniable. He demanded simplicity. She delivered it, better than expected. The accusation against her begins to collapse, not with apology, but with paperwork. Quiet corrections, rephrased emails, an investigation announced without enthusiasm. Authority hates spectacle when it's no longer in control. She remains unchanged. Same demeanor, Same silence. Same restraint. When students begin to look at her differently, she doesn't meet their gaze. Recognition that arrives late isn't owed a response. What lingers isn't triumph. It's unease. Questions ripple through hallways that once felt certain. Files are reopened. Other stories surface. The system doesn't fix itself. Cracks. And through it all, she continues exactly as she always has. Observing, writing, preparing. Because the truth didn't need her voice to survive. It just needed time. The first hearing is quiet by design. Authority prefers quiet rooms. Glass walls. Neutral colors. Chairs arranged so no one feels confronted. Only observed. Controlled language fills the space before anyone speaks. Procedures are explained. Expectations are outlined. She is advised gently to explain herself, to provide context, to help everyone understand how this misunderstanding happened. She doesn't. She listens instead, counts the number of people present, notes where they sit, notices who avoids eye contact and who doesn't bother pretending. Silence here isn't absence. It's leverage. When her turn comes, she doesn't narrate her life. She doesn't justify her presence. She slides documents forward. Originals, copies, dates clearly marked. Independent review requests already filed. She speaks once, briefly, to confirm the order of the materials. Her tone assumes truth doesn't require persuasion. The room adjusts. Pens pause. Someone rereads a date they thought they'd already understood. The hearing shifts from performance to process. External experts are called in next. That decision is framed as fairness. Names are removed from the work. Identifiers stripped away. The math will be evaluated without context, without biography, without the stories people use to decide who is credible. The waiting stretches. Not days, weeks. Silence from the institution returns, but this time it feels different. Not dismissive, careful. She attends class as usual. Same seat, same posture. The professor continues to teach. He references rigor often. Integrity. Standards. He never says her name. He doesn't need to. The room knows who he means. Authority prefers implication. It lets the crowd do the rest. When the results come back, they don't arrive with fanfare. Just a notice. Technical language. No adjectives. The work holds. Cleanly. Completely. Multiple reviewers reach the same conclusion independently. There are no notes questioning authenticity. No hedging language. The math stands on its own. The room where the findings are discussed feels smaller now. The chairs haven't moved, but the certainty has. Someone clears their throat before speaking. Another adjusts their glasses and rereads a line that doesn't change no matter how many times they look at it. Validation doesn't arrive as praise. It arrives as recalibration. Then a faculty member speaks. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Her voice is steady because it's practiced. She has waited years for this moment without knowing it. She remembers a graduate student from decades earlier. Brilliant. Quiet. Too quiet for his own protection. She remembers the way he challenged an advisor politely, methodically. She remembers how quickly he disappeared afterward. Removed from the program. Erased from records. She remembers the paper that followed months later, published under a different name. She never reported it. Fear is efficient like that. Keeps people alive by keeping them silent. The professor doesn't interrupt. He doesn't need to. His presence changes without movement. His shoulders remain squared. His posture unchanged. But the space around him shifts. His own words begin to surface. Recorded comments. Classroom statements. His demand for simplicity. His framing of belonging. His certainty that some people don't arrive knowing things like this. The equation he mocked is projected again, this time beside the older work. The missing structure becomes obvious. The alignment unmistakable. Dates matter. They always have. The older work predates his claim by years. The refinement matches too closely to dismiss. This isn't accusation anymore. It's comparison. Contradiction does the damage. Not shouting. Not moral outrage. Just alignment. His logic turns inward. The demand he made publicly is fulfilled better than expected. The certainty he projected becomes evidence against him. The accusation against her collapses quietly. Administratively, language is revised. Emails are rephrased. An investigation is announced without enthusiasm. Authority does not apologize when exposed. It restructures. Files resurface. Old complaints. Archived concerns once deemed unsubstantiated. Hallways change tone. Conversations stop when his name is mentioned. Silence returns, but not the kind that protects. The kind that waits. She remains unchanged. Calm. Measured. Silent. When eyes turn toward her, she doesn't respond. Recognition that arrives late doesn't alter posture. The room that once watched her now avoids her gaze, unsure what to do with someone who didn't perform the expected role. Power, when exposed, doesn't always rage. Sometimes it hesitates. Sometimes it recalculates. And hesitation spreads faster than certainty ever did. The balance has shifted, not because she demanded it, but because truth refused to stay buried. The investigation doesn't announce itself with urgency. It arrives the way authority prefers uncomfortable things to arrive. Measured, procedural, wrapped in language that sounds responsible but feels cautious. Notices are sent. Committees are formed. Timelines are extended. Nothing dramatic. Nothing decisive. Just enough motion to signal that something has shifted and enough delay to avoid admitting why. She watches it happen without comment. She has learned how systems behave when they are cornered. They don't confess. They audit. They don't apologize. They review. Silence becomes administrative rather than personal, and that distinction matters. It means the truth has moved beyond her. The professor continues to appear composed. In public spaces, he maintains the same posture, the same clipped authority. He doesn't soften. He doesn't clarify. He doesn't acknowledge the inquiry directly. Instead, he leans harder into performance. His lectures grow sharper. His references to standards and discipline become more frequent. He repeats the same phrases he always has, as if repetition might restore certainty. Ego doesn't retreat quietly. It doubles down. But the room has changed. Students listen differently now. They glance at one another when he speaks about merit. When he talks about earned belonging. A comment that once passed without friction now scrapes. Authority is still loud, but legitimacy has thinned. That's the difference. Power can survive exposure. Legitimacy can't. She continues attending class. Same seat. Same notes. Same restraint. She notices how often the professor avoids the side of the room where she sits. Not intentionally. Instinctively. The kind of avoidance that happens before someone is aware they're doing it. He doesn't look at her when he speaks about rigor anymore. He looks past her, over her, as if proximity itself has become risky. Outside the classroom, conversations shift. A student stops her one afternoon, then thinks better of it and walks away without saying anything. Another asks a question about an assignment that has nothing to do with the investigation, then adds, quietly, "I'm glad you didn't explain yourself." It's not gratitude. It's recognition. It arrives without warmth, without apology, late and a little strained, exactly how it always does. The faculty member who spoke up is called in again. So are others. Patterns emerge. Dates align. The same name appears across complaints separated by years, by departments, by students who never met one another. Individually dismissed. Collectively undeniable. Authority didn't just fail once. It repeated itself. That repetition becomes the story. Meetings grow longer. More people attend. Language becomes cautious. Words like potential misconduct and historical review appear. The institution frames its actions as diligence, not accountability. Scrutiny is introduced without admitting fault. That's how systems protect their image while adjusting their structure. She is invited to observe parts of the process, not as a witness, not as a victim, as a participant whose presence is now required for legitimacy. She attends when asked. She speaks only when necessary. When she does, her words are factual. Dates, documents, clarifications. She never raises her voice, never editorializes. The power imbalance is no longer useful to anyone. Facts do the work. The professor is asked to respond to inconsistencies. He doesn't reflect. He doesn't reconsider. He defends his work as original. He questions the motives of others. He frames the inquiry as overreach. Authority never doubts itself on record. Can't afford to. But his certainty sounds different now. Less anchored. More performative. His words are replayed against timelines he didn't anticipate being compared. The contradiction sharpens. The equation he dismissed publicly is shown again, paired with the earlier notebooks. The missing steps align perfectly. His framing collapses under its own weight. He demanded simplicity. He demanded public demonstration. He demanded exposure. He got all of it, just not the outcome he expected. The investigation widens. It no longer centers on her. That's the most telling shift. She has become irrelevant to the question being asked. The system is now examining itself, reluctantly, unevenly, but visibly. That visibility matters. Legitimacy only collapses when people are allowed to see the cracks. There is no moment of triumph. No announcement that resolves everything cleanly. Instead, there is an extended pause where certainty used to live. Hallways fill with speculation. Faculty meetings stretch late. Policies are referenced that haven't been cited in years. Silence spreads, but not the kind that erases. The kind that waits for something else to surface. She keeps writing, keeps studying, keeps preparing. Her routine doesn't change. Growth happened long before this moment. Offstage, quietly. She doesn't need the system to affirm it now. When the inquiry is formally acknowledged, the language is careful. An investigation has been launched. No conclusions yet. No names mentioned publicly. Authority protects itself even as it adjusts. Recognition, when it arrives, is indirect. Her record is cleared without ceremony. Her work is validated without praise. The absence of accusation replaces affirmation. She accepts it without reaction. Validation that costs nothing isn't worth responding to. Validation that arrives late doesn't require gratitude. The room that once watched her now watches itself. Students question what they once accepted. Faculty reconsider what they once ignored. The system doesn't heal. It destabilizes. That's the point. She leaves one afternoon after class. Notebook under her arm. Steps measured. Posture unchanged. No one stops her. No one challenges her. No one applauds. The last action is small. Ordinary. Walking out into the same world she entered. Power didn't fall because she fought it. It faltered because it contradicted itself. And once contradiction is visible, silence no longer protects the wrong side. There is no apology. There never is. Authority doesn't apologize when it's exposed. It adjusts. It reroutes. It protects itself while pretending to correct course. Recognition arrives sideways, the way it always does when it's forced instead of chosen. A role is quietly removed from a website. Committee chair is reassigned. A publication is flagged for review with language so careful it barely feels like consequence. The investigation doesn't close. That's the signal. When institutions want something forgotten, they rush to resolve it. When they want to survive it, they keep it open indefinitely. Statements are released, carefully written, passive. Concerns were raised. Processes are under review. Historical matters are being examined. No subject, no admission, just verbs floating without ownership. The language is designed to sound responsible without sounding guilty. Most people accept it. Some don't. That's enough. A scholarship is announced months later. Framed as progress. Framed as commitment. Named after a man erased too early. Too conveniently. The announcement avoids detail. It doesn't say why the name matters now. It doesn't say what made the timing necessary. It doesn't mention who paid the cost for that name to resurface. But the room feels it anyway. The applause is polite, measured. Applause that wants to move on. She returns to class the following term. Same building. Same room. Same seat near the back. She sits the same way she always has. Spine straight, notebook open, no announcement, no acknowledgement, no performance of victory. She doesn't scan the room to see who's watching. She doesn't need to. She never did. The professor is gone, replaced quietly without explanation to the class. Authority doesn't narrate its exits. It lets absence do the work. People speak to her differently now. Not openly, not warmly, just differently. Conversations pause when she approaches, then resume in softer tones. Questions are asked with more care. Assumptions are withheld instead of offered freely. Respect arrives late, dragged behind evidence, reluctant to admit how wrong it once was. No one apologizes for the laughter. No one references the whispers. That silence remains unpaid. She doesn't collect it. The system doesn't heal. It fractures. That's the part outsiders don't always understand. Justice, when it's real, doesn't create harmony. It creates instability. Questions linger. Other files reopen. Complaints that once disappeared are reconsidered. Not all of them, just enough to unsettle certainty. Silence, once a shield, becomes suspicious. People hesitate before dismissing what they don't want to hear. That hesitation matters more than closure ever could. Years pass without ceremony. Time moves the way it always does, forward and uneven. She graduates, continues studying, continues working. Her name appears on things that matter quietly, without spectacle. She doesn't become a symbol publicly. She doesn't need to. Symbols get consumed. She prefers continuity. Eventually, she teaches. Not because the story demands it, but because it makes sense. She teaches quietly, patiently. She recognizes silence when she sees it in others. The difference between fear and preparation. The difference between being overlooked and choosing not to perform. She helps students survive spaces that once tried to erase her, not by warning them loudly, but by giving them tools, structure, time, permission to think before speaking. She rarely tells her story. When she does, it's factual. Dates, documents, no embellishment. She doesn't need to be believed anymore. The proof already exists. The institution continues to change unevenly. Some reforms stick, others fade. That's how systems work. They don't transform all at once. They shift under pressure and hope memory fades faster than scrutiny. But something has changed permanently. Certainty no longer lives where it used to. People pause now. People look twice. Silence is no longer neutral. The final image isn't triumph. There's no standing ovation. No closing speech, just continuity. A classroom, a board, a lesson unfolding without cruelty. Students listening without fear. A problem presented without humiliation attached. The absence of spectacle feels intentional, necessary. The moral doesn't arrive as a declaration. It settles quietly, the way truth often does when it's allowed to remain long enough. Power depends on silence. Truth depends on time. And brilliance, especially Black women's brilliance, doesn't demand the spotlight. It outlasts it. Time keeps moving, indifferent to who once held power and who lost it. The investigation remains open long after the headlines fade, long after attention drifts elsewhere. It becomes part of the institution's background noise, referenced occasionally, never resolved loudly. That unresolved state is intentional. Closure would suggest completion. Completion would suggest nothing else needs to be examined. So the process lingers, creating a quiet discomfort that no one can fully dismiss. Meetings reference it indirectly. Policies are rewritten without acknowledging why. Silence, once used to protect authority, is now treated with suspicion. She notices these changes without naming them. She has always been good at noticing what others overlook. In faculty lounges, conversations lower when certain topics arise. In classrooms, professors choose their examples more carefully. Language softens, not out of kindness, out of awareness. Awareness that eyes are open now, that records exist, that dates matter. Students approach her differently as the years pass. Some know the story in fragments. Some don't know it at all. They ask questions about coursework, about research paths, about how to survive rooms that weren't built with them in mind. She answers patiently, directly. She never frames herself as exceptional. She never frames the system as redeemed. She talks about preparation, about documentation, about letting people underestimate you until it becomes their mistake. Her guidance is practical, not inspirational. That's what lasts. The scholarship bearing her father's name grows quietly, one recipient at a time. No ceremonies beyond the necessary. The name returns to the institution's records permanently now, impossible to erase again without effort that would draw too much attention. That permanence is enough. It doesn't heal the past. It interrupts its repetition. Sometimes that's all justice can offer. She watches new faculty arrive who never knew the professor, who don't carry his certainty, who don't assume legitimacy without examination. The absence reshapes the space more than his presence ever did. Authority has learned, at least partially, that visibility cuts both ways. That public power invites public reckoning. Her own life remains deliberately ordinary. She publishes work, teaches classes, reviews papers, writes comments in margins the same way she once saw in old notebooks. Carefully, patiently. She doesn't rush conclusions. She doesn't dismiss questions too quickly. She understands the damage of being unheard long before this institution ever acknowledged it. That understanding shapes how she moves through the world now. Occasionally, someone asks how it felt. The day at the board, the accusation, the silence. She answers honestly but briefly. She doesn't dramatize it. Drama belongs to those who needed the spectacle. For her, it was always about endurance, about staying long enough for the truth to surface on its own terms. The system never apologizes directly. It never fully accounts for what it allowed. That remains unresolved. But it no longer claims innocence either. It exists in a state of awareness that didn't exist before. A crack that light passes through unevenly. Some days barely noticeable, other days impossible to ignore. Her presence becomes part of that awareness, not as a symbol but as a constant. She sits in meetings, writes notes, listens more than she speaks. When she does speak, it's factual, corrective, calm. Ego never enters the room with her. That restraint continues to unsettle people who expect victory to be loud. The final moments are small. A student pauses before asking a question, then asks it anyway. A professor hesitates before making a joke at someone else's expense, then doesn't. A policy draft includes a clause that didn't exist years ago. None of these moments feel cinematic on their own. Together, they signal something shifting beneath the surface. She leaves a classroom one evening as the building empties. Lights dim, hallways quiet. She locks the door behind her, chalk dust still on her fingers. She doesn't look back. She doesn't need to. The space no longer threatens to erase her. Power didn't disappear. It never does. But it learned something costly. Silence is no longer guaranteed. And truth, given enough time, always finds a way to remain.